This is part 2 of the history of Barkers of Wilkes County, North Carolina. Part 1 ended as the American Revolution came to a close and with George Sr. as a growing landowner. In 1786, Americans suffered from post-war economic depression, including a shortage of currency, high taxes to pay for the war, and with lots of farm foreclosures and bankruptcies. But George Sr. seems to have held on to his land. In 1787, John and Hezekiah were living in their parents' household. 3 white females were listed as well, but without ages. At least 2 of them may have been daughters, but it would be more than half a century before others besides heads of household were listed by name in census data. This failure to list even wives by name is why early genealogy is male-centered. Since the end of the War of Independence from Britain, the 13 independent states had been operating under the Articles of Confederation. In September 1787, delegates met at the State House, now known as Independence Hall, in Philadelphia, with George Washington presiding, and hammered out a draft of the Constitution. It was ratified by the states in 1788 and went into effect the following year, and George Washington was sworn in as the first president of the United States. Hezekiah married his neighbor, Susanna Sebastian, at about the time the Constitution was being drafted or ratified, and he was head of his own household in the first U.S. Census 2 years later in 1790. He would have at least 6 sons and several daughters. He would amass between 800 and 1,000 acres of land along Mulberry Creek near his dad in Wilkes County. George Jr. married Elizabeth Sater before 1790 and would also have several children. John, then about 20, married Jane Porter in 1793. About the same time that an inventor named Eli Whitney was putting the finishing touches on an invention he called the cotton gin that would revolutionize the cotton industry and cause an explosion in the slave trade. John and Jane's first child was Violet, born in 1796. They would have at least 7 more by 1811. George Sr. and all 3 of his sons were living near each other in Wilkes County in the 1800 census as heads of their own households. George Jr. and Hezekiah suffered the all too familiar Barker indignity of being mistaken for a baker and having to have their R inserted above their names. George Jr. claims in his pension application in 1835 that he had moved to Virginia in 1799. He was probably confused about the exact dates, but George Jr. does seem to have been moving back and forth between the 2 locations. 3 years later, in 1803, the U.S. bought vast lands west of the Mississippi River from France, known as the Louisiana Purchase, for about $236 million in today's dollars. President Thomas Jefferson asked Congress for funds for an expedition to explore the new territory and search for a route to the Pacific. Jefferson's private secretary, Meriwether Lewis, planned the trip, asking his good friend William Clark to join and would be called the Corps of Discovery Expedition. They set off in May 1804. About the time of the expedition's triumphant return in 1806, George Barker Sr. died. It is not known where he is buried, but there are or were reportedly 11 fieldstones on his property or nearby. As of this time, nobody living knows where they are or might have been. George Jr. and his family had been living in Russell County, Virginia when his dad died. It was formed from part of Washington County where he had mustered into the militia at least twice during the Revolution. He sold 200 acres of Wilkes County land he had apparently been holding on to after his dad's death, or maybe it was George Sr.'s land. By 1810, only Hezekiah and his son, Hezekiah Jr., were still listed in the Wilkes County census. John and his family most likely had joined his older brother in Virginia. The winds of war were beginning to stir again as Britain's war with France under Napoleon threatened to spill over into the Americas. British warships had been boarding and searching American vessels and seizing American as well as British seamen, claiming that they were British deserters. Trade restrictions and British support for Indian tribes against American expansion were too much, and the United States declared war on Britain in June 1812. The War of 1812 was fought mainly in the Atlantic Ocean and the Canadian frontier along the St. Lawrence Seaway and the Great Lakes. In 1814, the British burned the White House in Washington, as well as other government buildings, and American morale sank to a new low. But early the next year, General Andrew Jackson became a national hero when he crushed the British at the Battle of New Orleans. The war ended a month later. A year later, in 1816, Hezekiah Barker died at about age 56 in Wilkes County of unknown causes. Both George Jr. and his brother John were found in the 1820 Scott County, Virginia census, although it is possible that they didn't actually move, since it was formed in 1814 from parts of Russell County and simply had the county subdivided so that they were now living in Scott. George Jr. can be seen here with his son Jesse as head of his own household, and John with sons John Jr. or John Jack and Williamson as heads of households. Once again, there is a discrepancy in George Jr.'s statement in his Revolutionary War pension application in 1835, where he states that he moved to Kentucky in 1809, fully 11 years before being found back in Virginia. With that large a gap, it has to be assumed that he indeed moved to some place in Kentucky before returning to Virginia, but there is no record of where he went or how long he stayed. Sometime around 1821 or 1822, George Jr. and John left Virginia for good with their families and headed for the wilderness of the mountains of the Kentucky. Only 2 decades earlier, it had been the domain of Indian tribes, including the Cherokee, Wyandot, Delaware, Chickasaw, and the much feared Shawnee. While many white settlers poured into Kentucky from the north along the Ohio River, George Jr. and his brother John most likely followed the wilderness road through the Cumberland Gap. One can only imagine their sense of wonder as they viewed the vistas that lay before them beyond the western slopes of the Appalachian Mountains. They ended their journey in the newly formed Morgan County, Kentucky. Whether that was their pre-planned destination, perhaps an area seen or stayed in by George Jr. on a previous trip, or just a place they liked along the way is not known. In any case, they settled along Caney Creek south of the county seat of West Liberty. Today there is a tributary of Caney Creek called Barker Branch, with a Barker Branch Road running alongside of it off Route 191 at Malone. Curiously, there are 2 Barker Branch roads and both seem to be dead ends and are not connected, but only the northernmost road has a stream named for Barker. One could be where John lived and the other where George Jr. lived, but only one deed for 75 acres of land can be found, purchased by John in 1825. The location cannot be determined from this meets and bounds surveyed land. About the same time that George Jr. and John headed for Kentucky, Hezekiah's widow, Susanna, and 5 of her sons left as well, living briefly in 2 places in Tennessee before buying 50 acres of land in Elliott County, Kentucky, just north of Morgan County in 1827. Only her son Lewis stayed behind as one of the few Barker descendants of the entire clan that had inhabited Wilkes County in the late 18th century. John and Jane were deacon and deaconess of the South Fork Baptist Church just up the road from where they lived, and is one of the oldest churches in the region today. It is likely that George and Elizabeth were members too, but there's no record of it. There is a gravestone in the church cemetery of an Elizabeth Barker with a death date of 1825. Some believe it was George Jr.'s wife, but the 1830 census shows a white female in the age 60 to 69 column in his household and is probably her. John and Jane also had a daughter named Elizabeth, but she married in 1828. That leaves either an unknown daughter of George Jr.'s or his and John's mother, who may have come to be near her 2 sons after their father died in 1806. Unfortunately, the date of birth that could resolve this issue cannot be read. John's wife Jane died in 1830 at about age 50, but the date of birth cannot be read on her gravestone either. It was that year that Congress passed the Indian Removal Act, sending all tribes to reservations west of the Mississippi, resulting in the Trail of Tears episode in 1838. 2 years earlier, in 1836, George Barker Jr. went to live with one of his sons in Park County, Indiana. This may have been soon after his wife died, since there is no mention of her moving with him, but there is no known gravestone for her in Kentucky or Indiana. About the same time George Jr. moved, Texas was trying to gain independence from Mexico, and about 100 Texians, including David Crockett, were overwhelmed by General Santa Anna's army at the small Spanish mission called the Alamo. An old and infirm George Jr. had applied for and was granted a Revolutionary War pension in 1834-35. George died in Indiana perhaps as late as 1846, but the location of his grave is unknown. In 1849, John Barker died and was buried next to Jane in the South Fork Church Cemetery, seen here with third great-grandson Marvin Barker in 2002, bringing to an end the second generation of our known Barkers in America. The third generation awaits in part 3 of this video series.